I'm talking again with John Wheeler, and John has graciously offered to share his insights and pointers with all of those who may be interested in the end of suffering. And one of the things that has come up in the last couple of days of some of the people that write back and forth to me is they seem to kind of get stuck on, okay, I'm looking for the I and I don't find anything, but there's still suffering. And their bottom line question kind of becomes, well, how do I do this investigation? They're not, doing that game of, well, if there's no me, who's going to investigate? No, they're really sincere. Mm-hmm. And, they're kind of asking for some pointers in, well, how do I do this? I really want to get to the bottom of this, and I can see if I look for the I or the me, there is no me or I there. And yet it still seems to be operating somehow because there's still suffering happening, perhaps some sense that something's wrong, or, things ought to be different than they are somehow, and then the emotional turmoil that comes with that.
We had a recent discussion where we were talking about this experience that people have of what I call jumping to the endgame. Mm-hmm. And that means kind of jumping ahead, grasping on to some pointer or some teaching that they've heard, and like, for example, investigating the I, or they hear that they're supposed to understand that there's no I there. And what we discussed recently was really appreciating the fact that there's kind of a series of insights that kind of build towards that, and we have to appreciate that and understand how that conclusion or is has been arrived at. This statement that there is no I and what that means, it's kind of it's not something we want to just see in a vacuum and kind of jump right to the end of that. That's really kind of the culmination of a way of looking at things, a deep way of understanding who we are. So we want to make sure that the steps along the way are seen as well, because that statement that there's nobody here is really the final, kind of insight along a certain way of looking. So I always want to be sure that we understand why that statement is important and why we're looking at that in the first place, and have we seen the points along the way clearly.
All right.
Because if we haven't, we'll just be trying to assert this kind of final concept or this pointer and saying, well, I don't understand it, I don't see how it applies. And perhaps we're not even quite sure what it means, mm-hmm. or why we're looking, or what exactly we're looking for.
Well, the people that I'm talking to are really, they're not so much sort of trying to argue or jump to the end game or anything like that, but more that they're. Well, let me just read you something that one fellow wrote. He says, I've been asking who am I and asking who is asking. I come up with blankness, nothing. At this stage, it doesn't feel like I can do any more than this, i.e. just rest with this and move on. What am I missing? And what I wrote back is, well, what is missing for whom? So there's an oxymoron in there, that there's the claim that there's the seeing that there's this blankness, and yet then right on the heels of that comes the question, what more can I do? What am I missing? And so I think if we could somehow address that dilemma, because it seems to be a pretty common one.
Well, I actually go back to something even more basic than this, and that is the real point of this, the real meaning of this non-duality is to know who you are and to know what your nature is. And, for years I was involved in self-inquiry and meditation and doing all kinds of things. And what I realized later, when this was pointed out to me in a more direct way, was that I didn't know who I was. I didn't really understand what my nature was. And you can ask yourself, who am I? You can do investigations, you can meditate, you can do all kinds of things. But it's very important that we don't lose sight of the whole purpose of this whole thing, which is, we want to understand what our nature is. And I would actually, what I tend to do when this kinds of thing, when this type of thing comes up, is I kind of want to check in and make sure whether the person has a good sense of what their true nature is. And oftentimes what you find is that question or that consideration has somehow fallen to the background. I mean, if I don't have a good sense or a clear sense of what I am, and then I'm kind of involved in these investigations and asking who am I, that really becomes kind of a dead end, because the question who am I, or the investigation, is often just being done at a mental level, and there's all kinds of assumptions there, like, if I can do this, I will achieve something. There's a kind of an end gaining thing. There's an assumption that I need to have something that I don't have. And the problem with all of these things is that the heart and soul, the fundamental essence of this whole thing, is actually being completely overlooked. And so I would rather, even before discussing these issues of the inquiry into the nature of the I, get back to the fundamental point of is the positive truth of what your nature is that clear? Because I kind of, that's the way that this was pointed out to me, and it was much more accessible, much more available to me in my experience, was starting out with looking at who you are, because everybody knows that they are, everybody knows their own presence, and that's really what is being investigated. This discussion of the suffering and the separate I and how that works, and is there a separate me? This is not the heart of it. This is not the essence of it. This is really just a way of understanding needless suffering and what that suffering is based on. So if we launch into that without being clear on who we are, I think we're going to find ourselves getting into a little bit of trouble with that.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things I said to this fellow is that just don't overlook the presence behind all the appearance, which allows for whatever is happening. That the presence behind the story, behind consciousness, even behind or prior to the being knowing I am, is all there really is, like an is. And what I was trying to point out there is that just exactly the way you pointed it out to me way back when, which is that to know the positive truth of what you are, that to know that beyond any shadow of any remaining doubt, without that as a starting point, you can go on with self-inquiry or whatever forever, can't you?
Yeah, because I would rather be, curious as to why someone why are they engaging in self-inquiry? Why are they even interested in examining whether there's an I or not? And I think oftentimes we're not really clear why we're doing that. And, there's no, if your nature is clear, and there's no confusion about what you are, that's all that you basically need to see. That's what the whole point of this, this is, because you're going to find that what you are is, not a suffering, separate, limited person. That sense of being, or that innate natural state, or however you want to point to that, is by no means is that some kind of defective person. And so, I often kind of say, it's just more of a pointer just for emphasis, is that, most of 90% or something, the bulk of this, looking at this should be on this, positive side of what your true nature actually is. And then that being clear and realizing and having a real solid sense of what you are, then we can look at this kind of what I would call any residual suffering or doubts or questions, to see what is the root of those. Now, so I would recommend rather doing that once it's very stable and clear, the simple truth of what you are, because then we can look at these questions and look at these doubts and things like that from the perspective of already knowing the truth, of what I am. And then instead of that looking becoming this kind of interminable kind of end-gaining thing where I'm looping in thought, trying to get something. I already know that I'm free. I already know what my nature is. I already know the truth of that. And so I'm looking at the suffering, looking at the questions from that perspective of seeing them basically as a kind of a needless appearance or a baseless appearance on the truth of what I am. And so I'm actually examining those questions from the recognition of my inherent freedom. And then these questions like, what is the root of suffering and all those kind of things, they tend to make more sense. They're more effective that way.
Okay.
At least that was my experience.
Yeah. I can hear the question on its way. That, well, okay, how do we nail that positive side down once and for good? That the pointers have come, perhaps it's been seen, but then, how does the stability and the clarity of that really hit home once and for all?
Well, it goes back to the basic point that you can't deny your being. And, it's very simple really, but, all the non-duality traditions are saying, there's something quite extraordinary about your nature, and have a look and see for yourself. And there's different pointers, but the one that was shared with me and, very basic is, start with the fact of your existence. Everybody listening to this realizes they're present, knows that they are, has that sense of being itself. And what I would encourage is be very, very interested, very, very curious about that, and not philosophizing about it, not conceptualizing, not reading and quoting what others say, but really laying down all of those kinds of conceptual approaches and literally having a look in direct experience to notice what is the sense of this being and what are its qualities. And that's where people say, well, where does the certainty come in, or where does that conviction come in? And the way that it comes in is if you look at your sense of existence now, and anybody can do this, and just notice how sure you are of that fact. Mm-hmm. How certain it is that I am. And you'll see that it's not that you drum up this kind of certainty, or you drum up a conviction, or you do something extraordinary, and then as a result you suddenly arrive at this kind of recognition. It's actually very, very different and much more simple than that. And that is that you turn to something in your experience that you discover by nature is utterly beyond doubt, utterly clear, utterly certain, and that's where the certainty comes from. It doesn't come from something you do or anybody does. It doesn't come from an experience or an awakening or any investigation. All those things are just kind of adornments of experiences that are coming and going, but we want to lock in and really notice something that by its nature is clear and solid and certain. And the one thing that anybody can turn to and notice immediately, no matter what they understand or what experiences they've had, is that undeniable core sense of their very presence itself.
Yeah.
And that's why, the sages and the traditions, they talk about the nature of reality. And they point to this nature of being itself as that reality. And why do they do that? Because that being is beyond any doubt. It's not subject to conceptual argumentation. It's not coming and going. It's not a personal experience. It's not conditional. So that being, which is everyone is that's why it's pointed to as reality, because it's completely unconditioned. And that's every listener, every person, every sentient being at any moment of time, that fact is true, universally and unconditionally true for everyone at every moment. And that's why we must look at that. That's the one thing, the one point that must be understood and recognized above all other, all other spiritual pointers.
Yeah.
Because if I'm looking at that and I'm considering that, then this stuff becomes marvelously clear, very lucid, very immediately. If I'm not looking at that, all of the spiritual things that we tend to do just become, I don't know, they're just like a maze, endlessly kind of sorting through things. And, even if it's self-inquiry or studying Vedanta or going to teachings or having experiences, even all of those things are not conclusive because they're all still just looking away from the heart of it.
Yeah.
So and anybody can do that right now by just pausing, stopping, and starting to notice for themselves. What is this doubtless sense of being that's with me that I can't deny? In fact, that, and which I am, because, I am that which exists. My existence is. I'm not separate from my existence.
One guy who had this insight, he said, it was all over for, and then he said his name, it was all over for the me. It was all over for the person. And what was left was, I am, period, full stop. And that's the best description, perhaps, that I've heard. It's just that, I think what the mind does, and we maybe talk about this, is that that the mind has to have a concept. So it has to turn the ungraspable into something it can seem to own or describe or represent somehow. Some concept.
Yeah, well, that's if we are still assuming that this has something to do with the mind. This understanding, we call it understanding, just for lack of a better word, this recognition, this immediate knowing of reality or of what you are, it's not a mental operation. It's not a result of a conceptual process. You do not, the mind actually, the conceptual mind has almost zero to do with any of this. And that's a very important lesson, and I think it needs to strike home, early on as we're trying to appreciate this stuff, is that we are not utilizing the conceptual mind or the thinking process or reasoning or proof or something like that connected with what we're talking about. It's in a very different dimension of experience, because you're already present, you already exist, even before the next thought appears, even before you would attempt to use your mind or to turn to the conceptual mind for some kind of knowledge. Your basic existence is already there, and that's what we're talking about. So that pointer about that the answer's not in the mind, or seeing that we're not looking to the mind for some kind of confirmation, that is a big one, because if we're still struggling with that, if we're still turning to the mind, we're going to be missing the simplicity of this. I'd rather say, pause the mind, pause the thinking, let the mind function for relative affairs. But when it comes to the recognition of being what you are not going to be using that. Because, even if you say to someone, can you recognize your being? It's a very clear, very certain recognition there, and it's not being recognized by the conceptual mind. It doesn't even relate to that level of experience. So that's one of those lessons, or kind of one of those pointers that's very important to see.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if we start thinking, well, is it this? Is it that? Or maybe it's this question. Maybe it's that question. We're just going to be following the mind. We're going to be watching the mind, and we're going to be actually looking away from this. And it leads to doubt, because the mind is endlessly questioning and contradicting itself, and what if this, and and what if that? But the pure being stands here ever present, kind of in its nakedness, beyond any doubt whatsoever, completely free of the mind and its doubts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that really that nails it down, I think, as good as can be done with language. And that to try and grasp it with a concept, of course, is just thinking about and mental.
Yeah, thinking about being is not being.
Yeah.
You know? Thinking about what you are is not being what you are. Thinking about non-duality or thinking about various questions or things that we might have read in terms of spirituality has very little to do with the immediate recognition of what is real in your direct experience. Yeah, people I think don't realize how simple this is. This is not like getting something pointed out, thinking about it, going along a certain track of experiencing and somehow getting closer and closer, and then at some point you say, well, now I've got it. This has nothing to do with that at all. It's actually so very, very simple, because it's a pointing to saying, hey, for any other experiencing to be, you must be there. That's just stated as a fact, and it's not really even rationalized. It's just noticed as a sheer basic fact. Oh, I know that I am. That's a given fact, and it's really a kind of stunning, in fact, how it really works, so to speak, is because it's simply a fact that's already present, that's just pointed to, and if we are open to follow that pointer, there's an immediate looking, an immediate confirmation of the truth of that pointer, and the understanding or the recognition is immediate. There's no time involved. There's no process involved. It's just look at this and notice this fact. And if we can take that very simply, we'll just immediately look, verify that indirect experience, and say, oh, yeah, of course, now I know that.
Mm.
And I've talked to this with people, if they're open to hear this, where, literally in 5 minutes, what we're talking about jumps out as crystal clear, absolutely certain.
Yes.
Because it's that simple. It's not rocket science. This is very, very immediate.
It's almost like noticing air.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, now if we've caught that point about, we're not going to be looking in the mind, that saves a lot of the strife, really, because, the mind might say, what about this and what about that? And if we've realized that the answer, or, the essence that we're pointing to is really not defined in anything the mind can grasp, and we'll just let those questions go without even considering them, not even paying attention to them. Because if we don't see that point, then every time the mind throws up a question or a doubt, we're going to go jump on board and say, well, gee, maybe I need to figure this out, and is it true, and what's the proof, and who said this, who said that. But that's not going to get you any closer to what you already are. And so if you see that, you'll see almost immediately that this turning to the mind and its questions is a complete trap, in the sense that it doesn't lead anywhere. It doesn't lead you to any clarity or any certainty at all. In fact, it's the complete reverse of that. Because if you look in your experience, you'll see that your being is doubtless, it's clear, needs no proof, is absolutely certain, and there's just an immediate focus, like a kind of a clarity around that. And whereas if you turn to the conceptual mind and it says maybe it's this and that, you're instantly in a sense of doubt, because the mind will make a claim about something, and then it can immediately contradict it with the opposite idea. So when we turn to conceptual knowledge to understand who we are, we find ourselves immediately in doubt and having a sense of having a question mark on everything, like, oh, I don't know anything. Like, none of this seems true. I can't figure this out. It's all very relative. But come back immediately to the being itself, and you'll see, there's not even the whiff of a question or a problem or any doubt on it at all, and that's immediate. That's immediately there. So that should give us the clue as to how we should be looking at this stuff.
And it's always there.
Yeah. You can turn to that sense of being anytime or as many times as you want and constantly verify that. Now, if you do that a few times, it's actually you're going to see the fact that what the people have been saying, what the teachings have been saying all along, and that being is doubtless and ever present and changeless, is just a simple fact of experience. For every single person that's hearing this right now, their being itself is unchanging, ever present, and doubtless right now, and always will be, because that's the definition of what being is. It's not an object or a conditioned appearance which is coming and going. And so we might as well acknowledge that. It's like Sailor Bob used to say, start with the recognition that you already are what you're seeking. And so, in other words, actually before you begin any kind of search or seeking, immediately acknowledge that fact. And actually, it's the end of the seeking. I mean, just as you're getting going and you recognize that fact as your premise, you realize that the seeking is over with, because that being or that presence actually is the reality that was pointed to all along. And even right now, everybody is that. There's nobody that can say they stand outside of that being. And again, that word is just a pointer. We're talking about that innate, doubtless sense of being here, which has this existence, but has that vivid luminosity, that aware quality in which everything is appearing. And that's why there's different pointers to that. But it's this awake, present, open, very, very solid sense of your own existence right now. And everybody is that. And that's why there's no like, some people have it, some don't, some awaken to it, some don't. All these things are just imaginary concepts. The truth of it is that every being, everybody, is fully and completely this and can be nothing other than this. It's just, and that's what we've actually heard all along, but we've missed the simplicity of it. Because the mind will come in and say, yeah, but what about this, what about that, maybe I'm separate. But those thoughts themselves, they just come and go in this which is still shining in all of its presence, all of its doubtlessness. You literally are that, and you cannot be anything other than that.
Well, that was one of the insights that happened here, is that separation, so-called separation, that there is no such thing as separation. It's just an idea.
Yeah.
And the idea comes and goes in what never changes.
Yeah, and who is separate from what? And the mind is sneaky in that way. It creates the notion of an entity or a separate one, a separate person, which is just an idea. There's nothing. It's just a concept, really. And then it starts to kind of extrapolate on that by starting to say, well, what's happening to that separate one, and where is he, and what level is he at, and maybe he needs to go deeper, and maybe he needs to awaken, and then he needs to embody the teaching and live it, and then someday he'll be liberated. All this is crap. There are very few people out there in the spiritual world basically telling the truth.
Right.
And that it's all a pile of crap.
Yeah, no kidding.
Because it's all imaginary conceptualizing, and what's the sad part about it, I guess you'd say, is that many people pursuing spirituality are still following down those concepts and haven't even realized that they're in a hall of mirrors. And completely out of sync with the basic point of it all. Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, who needs to be awakened when they are the supreme reality itself? I mean, who needs to be enlightened, so to speak? When that light of consciousness is what's looking right out of your eyes at every millisecond of your existence. And when people say, well, I need to stabilize in that, or I need to go live that, it's such an ego kind of a egocentric concept.
Yes.
I mean, how do you live or manifest or abide in what you already are. And who's doing that? And, these highest, seemingly, rarefied spiritual teachings turn out to be ego-centered stories.
Yes.
And because, when we look from the basics of this, they crumble away into meaningless conceptualizing without any foundation whatsoever.
Yeah, the lack of foundation, I think, is one of the most stunning pointers in this, is that, if this is a house built on quicksand, why do we keep adding stories?
Exactly.
And why do we add story on top of story when the essential story is false to begin with?
Yeah, and that's why it takes a kind of a while before you realize what's really being communicated, and that is we're not playing the game anymore. We're not adding levels. We're not massaging the appearance. We're not talking about what you will get or what you don't get. We're not agreeing with the typical spiritual teachings at all. We're diving down to the root premise and examining whether the whole foundation is based on anything real. Because you'll find that like I like to say, all of the seeking, suffering, and doubt that generates all of this kind of experience is all based on the premise that you're a limited person and somehow you've separated from reality. I mean, you can't pursue enlightenment or do inquiry or anything like that without the assumption somewhere down there in the basement that I'm incomplete somehow.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'll tell you, it's interesting. I ran across something in a book that a friend of mine wrote, and it was, what assumption am I making that I'm not aware I'm making that gives me what I see?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of powerful. And so, what assumption am I making? And isn't that core assumption that there is this assumption or premise that there's such a thing as the me, and that there's something wrong with that me?
Yeah, and this ties into kind of what you brought up at the beginning of the dialogue here, was that this looking at the sense of me. Now, I think in talking this way, once we've established the positive reality of what this is, and able to see, and we're able to see the truth of what we are, then we look back at those kinds of questions and realizing that all of our troubles, all of our questions and doubts have been conceptual. They're ideas and they're images in the mind, and they only trouble, when they appear as thoughts. And then you start to see that, well, all of those things are always in reference to this assumed separation, this assumed person who is different from reality, and that belief is like the fulcrum, or it's like that cornerstone of the conceptual mind, and that turns out to be why we are looking at that. We're not just looking at it to try to get some goal or to achieve something that we don't have, because we already know that we are that reality. But we're looking at that because we come to understand that idea is the glue that holds together the conceptual mind, and so that's why when you understand the context of this and you're looking at that, I find it's much more effective, because that I thought, or that personality thought, we can see it's also just another thought among all the other thoughts. It's just simply an idea coming and going in the positive truth of what I am. And that, when we're saying look at that I or examine that entity, what we're basically saying is just see the truth of what it is. I mean, realize that this fulcrum point of the mind is just a concept coming and going in what you are. It has no substance. It has no reality. It's not a thing that you can grasp and say, here is the person. It's only there when you're thinking about it.
Yes.
So, I mean, how can you be something that's only there when you're thinking about it? And this investigation like that can be wrapped up in a few minutes. When you have the right perspective here. This isn't something you're saying, well, I'm going to do my inquiry for 10 years and And I've been investigating for months and years, and I'm still not there. I mean, this is like you were saying. This is always just kind of still containing, the kind of the false perspective in those very questions themselves.
Yes.
So we're just laying this kind of thing bare on the table once we realize that it's all a pack of concepts. And oh, by the way, the root concept that holds it all together is just another concept too. And oh, by the way, I can't possibly be that. And there is no separate self except for the idea that there is a separate self.
Indeed.
So, and if I don't understand what I am, then that looking, becomes very kind of distorted, because I subtly feel that I'm trying to gain something as the very entity itself. Like, if I do this inquiry, maybe I'll get something, or am I doing it right? Or, it's all, and all those thoughts themselves are just part of the network of concepts as well. So
the never-ending story, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really something very, very simple. I mean, people don't realize how simple it is. It's basically like this. All my suffering is conceptual, and it's all rooted in this idea of a me. And, oh, by the way, that's just a thought coming and going. It's not what I am. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the end of it. Who is going to say that what they are is the thought of a person that's just flickering through their consciousness? And so that's the inquiry. If somebody's saying, well, how does that work, or what are you supposed to look at, or whatever, that's it. And it's not more than that. It's not like it's just a simple seeing. It's like a canceling of an assumed identity that we just never had noticed. So if I'm not that thought, if that thought or that image does not represent my identity, that's all that needs to be seen. And that's not going to bring you reality or give you your true nature, because you already know what that is, because you've already looked at that. But what it does, though, is it just cancels out the needless suffering based on an unexamined belief. That's why I say that's not really the heart of it. That's just a little footnote to the essence of it.
Yeah, and the major key really is, where are you starting from, isn't it?
Yeah, what's your assumption?
Right, what premise?
I would say, what am I assuming?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm a spiritual person, if I'm going for enlightenment, if I'm studying, if I'm following a teacher, if I'm doing a practice, I'm not even interested in any of that stuff. To me, all that stuff is bogus.
Yeah.
Because the real question is, who do you think you are? What is your definition of self that is what's propelling you to whatever activities, whatever undertakings that you're doing? And that's, if you can kind of catch that and realize, oh, that's what I need to be looking at here.
Yeah.
Then what you'll find is you'll slip. It's like kind of slipping out of a straitjacket when you realize that the straitjacket, there was no back on it, there were no straps on it. It was just all kind of assumed. Because when you look back at who am I and what is my assumption and what is the reality of this sense of self, it just turns out to be so clear, like so lucid, so obvious, that what you are has been innately free from the very beginning. And the bondage was only imagined for a character that never has been you in the first place.
Yeah, where was that character in the womb?
Yeah, that character wasn't. That's right. The character is just spun up and manufactured in the thinking process.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like Sailor Bob Addison used to say, or he still says, what's wrong with right now when you're not thinking about it? Meaning all of this stuff is basically just there only when you're conceiving it.
Yeah.
And other than that, it has no substance. You are that innate, changeless reality itself right now. Every person listening to this now is that. And it's that simple. And, I talk to people about this, and if they're ready to hear this and listening and paying attention to this and they follow this, it's recognized just that directly. Oh,
idiot, yeah.
Of course. How could it be any different? And people don't realize, how simple and how available this actually is, and how it really works in practice, so to speak, when you're following. It's when you're following along with this, it's just stunning, and you see that this seeking and suffering and problems and questions is how nobody needs to be struggling with that. I mean, nobody needs to be spinning around in that if they can catch the simplicity of what we're talking about. I mean, the suffering and the doubts and the problems can be over with today in listening to this now by just looking to the truth of these points. That's what tends to get missed, like if we're studying it in a book or something like that, maybe we're talking to somebody who's not particularly clear on this, but if you're actually talking with somebody who has seen this and has had this pointed out, you're going to catch that spirit of the vibrancy and the immediacy of this. This is something to see today. This is something to recognize now.
No waiting for this.
Exactly. And I was fortunate enough to start meeting people that, that were looking from this perspective, and it just kind of blew through a lot of my assumptions that I had been carrying around. This isn't difficult. Doesn't take any time. It's not a process. It's not, all of these things I think I was assuming, kind of unconsciously assuming that somehow in the background, these were the assumptions that I had.
Mm-hmm.
That nobody had ever pointed out. Nobody had ever really exposed the fallacy of that. And I mean, in my particular case, it was when I met Sailor Bob, and he basically said, "Look, this is it." And he was able to do that because that's the way it was pointed out to him, and that's the and I think we've seen in talking with people and meeting with people that same experience with this, the same embrace of this, is very, very available to many people who just would take a little bit of time to have a look for themselves.
I think the major key is what you have said mostly in the middle of this about starting from the one fact about there's absolutely no doubt, and that's the fact that being is, and it's inescapable.
Yeah, and there's a funny thing that people say, but it's true, and it's kind of interesting. It's the idea that even to doubt your existence, you must be present to have the doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why this cannot have any doubt. It cannot be something with these moving parts that maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Even the very doubt about this only proves what we're pointing to. Can't have the doubt without the reality of that presence of the true nature itself.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what your mind thinks. It doesn't matter what a thought or experience or emotion or state or what's going on in your, life. None of that at any time ever contradicts the basic reality of your existence. And that's the utter beauty, the utter kind of simplicity of it. And that's why I feel that out of all of the spiritual stuff, the one thing to be done, the one thing to be focusing on is looking at that.
Great. Very simple, very clear.
Yeah, well, that's and we've covered a fair amount, so it's good to good to let that digest a little bit.
We'll let this sink in, and perhaps another session next week.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So I hope that people listening to this can kind of jump on board with that and benefit from this experience that we're talking about. And there's no reason why they cannot do that.
Well, as Bob said once, it's not just for the few. This is really everyone's birthright. It's who everyone is. So, where's any exclusion in that? Can't be any, can there?
Nope.
Okay. Well, thank you again, John, and we'll talk next week.